Chapter 5 Elizabeth would have rather died than confess that she was struggling with her own desire. It had been weeks since she'd been separated from her husband, and she'd missed him desperately, missed his company and his touch. She tapped Velvet's ribs gently, and the horse quickened her pace. Elizabeth wanted to get to that cave, and fast. Her mouth curved as she recalled the first time she ever kissed a man, and that man had been Paxton Rain. Elizabeth had just celebrated her 19th birthday, and Paxton, who'd been hanging round the valley for more than a month, had carved her an exquisite figurine. He'd explained that he'd carved the statuette from soapstone, which his father had brought home with him from his travels abroad. Paxton described how New Englanders often used soapstone for their fireplace hearths, because of its unique ability to retain and consistently dispense heat for long periods of time. Paxton's father had educated him in the many uses of soapstone, such as sinks, countertops, bowls, and most intriguingly to Paxton, sculpture. Eventually his father created a lucrative construction business, and whenever he received a soapstone commission, he employed his son. After the job was concluded, Paxton had collected any discarded pieces of soapstone like they were gold. He'd worked diligently with the material until he'd learned to sculpt with it. When he had left home, he'd taken a substantial amount with him, just in case he was ever inspired to sculpt something on his journey. Elizabeth was accustomed to little gifts from her guest, though she secretly wondered at his motive for being so kind to her. Paxton was obviously a talented carver, which was evident by several of the charming wooden figurines he'd given her. But this one was so beautiful, unique, and clearly meant quite a lot to him. He told her it was a figurine of an Amazon princess and her loyal mare. "I have officially entitled her Royal Dalton." He coughed abashedly at the clever entitlement of his sculpture. "Well, she's a princess, and I'm giving her to you, Miss Dalton." She was so overcome with gratitude that she had quite unexpectedly wrapped her arms around him and kissed his cheek. This was a gesture she'd grown unaccustomed to. Her father was the only one she would ever hug or kiss on the cheek. It was obvious Paxton was also unfamiliar with this type of affection, because he flushed and pulled back from her warily. Alarmed at her spontaneous behavior, she turned away and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Rain. It's absolutely divine. My tutor told me all about the myths surrounding the Amazon women. He insisted it was only a myth, but I argued even myth has some element of truth in it." Paxton was pleasantly surprised with her knowledge of the myths, and this spurred a conversation about their educations. Elizabeth explained that her tutor, from England, was extremely stringent on proper pronunciation and oral dictation. They continued to speak about what they'd learned and the lessons that had meant the most to them. This conversation revealed they shared many common interests and dulled the tension that had hung so thickly in the air a moment ago. It was dark when Paxton announced that he should be leaving, as it was getting late. He said good night and left the cave. For some reason unknown to Elizabeth, his sudden departure had stung and left her feeling bereft. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up thinking about Paxton. She was dismayed when she realized she'd slept in so dreadfully late. It was past noon, and she feared Paxton might have gone off without her. She dressed quickly and went out in search of him. He was nowhere to be found, and Elizabeth felt acute disappointment. Thoughts and fears raced through her mind. Had she so offended him that he'd left forever? She waited for a moment, and then, when her stomach growled, she decided to prepare something to eat. Paxton would be back soon, she hoped. It was late afternoon, and she still hadn't seen any sign of the bounty hunter. She went to the lake, where they often sat and talked, but he was not there. Visiting his camp caused even more concern. There was absolutely no sign that he'd been there at all. No gear, no fire pit, nothing. She stood there for what seemed like hours, going over everything that had been said the previous night, trying to remember if he'd hinted anything about leaving or resenting her actions. Footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she turned around anxiously. "Paxton, I was—" The relieved smile faded as she realized it was not Paxton, but a complete stranger.
"Oh, I'm not Paxton, pretty lady, but I am looking for him."
His voice was deep and hard, and sent shivers down her spine. Although his exterior was mildly handsome, Elizabeth sensed an evil which made him appear loathsome, and she backed off slowly. "Who are you?" He removed his hat and bowed nonchalantly.
"Harrison Kent, at your service, ma'am."
His eyes glowed as he licked his lips.
"And I do mean at your service."
Elizabeth remembered the name instantly, and that Paxton had been pursuing this dangerous criminal. "What do you want with Paxton?" she demanded, the thought of the latter giving her strength she wouldn't have otherwise possessed.
"Well, I thought we might have tea and strike up a friendship,"
he quipped sarcastically. He pulled a gun from his belt and pointed it straight at Elizabeth.
"I'm going to kill him, girlie. Noticed he ain't chasing me no more, and I'll bet his guard's down thinking I'm long gone. I'll get him now and be done with him. No one be after me then. Freedom."
His voice became a low, vicious growl.
"Now, be a good girl and tell me where he's at."
"I don't know," she murmured, watching the gun. His smile faded into an ugly, threatening glare.
"Tell me where he's at, or I'll put a gaping hole through that pretty face of yours."
"I honestly don't know," she declared, and then added defiantly, "Even if I did know, I certainly wouldn't tell you." He snarled, irked by her response.
"He's gotta be around here somewhere. I can smell him."
His eyes shifted about as he surveyed their surroundings malevolently. Noting his distraction, Elizabeth cautiously knelt down, retrieved a large rock from the ground, and without any hesitation threw it at his head with all her strength. He grunted, surprised by her attack, and felt where the rock hit, leaving a gash. Kent peered down at the blood on his fingers, and looked up to see Elizabeth running away. He swore viciously. Enraged, he started after her, intent on causing her severe pain. He was reluctant to shoot her for 2 reasons. 1, the sound of the gun would alert Paxton, who had by now let his guard down to danger, and 2, the woman obviously cared for Paxton, and might come in handy as bait. Elizabeth searched frantically for an escape route, knowing Kent was close behind her and would likely catch her too. Then she saw Paxton, mounted on his horse Castro, riding towards her. She realized he wasn't aware of what was going on, and Kent, who had his gun ready, would find him an easy target. "No!" she cried, terrified at the thought of Kent killing Paxton. Quickly, she plunged to the ground and rolled towards her attacker. Kent, who'd just noticed his quarry, tripped over her, landing hard, the gun falling from his grasp. He was stunned from yet another surprise attack, and also from the fall, and consequently he was too slow to react. Elizabeth grabbed the gun, pointed it at him, and declared fiercely, "I know how to use this, and I'm not afraid to. Don't think that just because I'm a woman I'll hesitate to kill you, because I won't." She cocked the gun and glared him down. Harrison Kent put up his hands, defeated. Paxton, who'd watched the entire scene from his saddle, dismounted and retrieved the rope from his saddlebag. He then proceeded to tie up the captured criminal. "Well done, Elizabeth," he beamed at her admiringly. "You are quite a woman. You've just captured one of the most elusive and wanted criminals in the territory." "He's worth a large bounty. Congratulations." She blushed under his exuberant praise. "It wasn't on purpose, and besides," she faltered, not wanting to admit she'd only thought of him the whole time, and didn't give a snit about the commission.
"Yes. Congrats, Elizabeth," Kent crooned caustically, glowering at her.
"Besides, he underestimated me," she retorted spitefully, deciding to finish her sentence off after all, for Kent's benefit.
"You'd best watch it, girlie, 'cause I won't be making the same mistake twice," Kent threatened menacingly.
Paxton punched him solidly, knocking him out cold. Then, noticing that Elizabeth was looking at him curiously, he confessed,
"Well, I didn't want to bother with a gag."
"Where did you go today?" Elizabeth demanded, shrugging off the subject of Kent.
"Elizabeth, is that blood?"
Paxton exclaimed, rushing over to her and examining her arm where blood was evident. "Did he hurt you?" Heat flared through her body at his touch. "No," she said weakly, confused and overwhelmed by the reaction her body was having. "I'm sure that happened when I rolled."
"That was a brave thing you did,"
he uttered slowly, his voice unusually husky and introverted. "I couldn't bear the thought of him killing you, Paxton," she admitted, trying hard to avoid peering into his handsome face. There was a stillness, like a spell, that hovered gently around them, erasing the rest of the world, as she thought of his lips touching hers. She was sure he was going to kiss her, and she wanted him to, so badly. The spell was completely eradicated when he turned around sharply, letting her go and remarking distantly, "I'll have to take him in." Fury flashed in her eyes, and she said roughly, "You do that then, Paxton Rain. I won't miss you, and don't bother coming round here no more," she huffed, too devastated by his icy rejection to care about good grammar. "You obviously have no desire to be near me." Her voice shook, and she knew she sounded ridiculous, which only made her angrier. Determined to maintain her remaining dignity, she nodded curtly at Paxton, who was completely astounded by her behavior, and turned to leave. Paxton seized her good arm and turned her round to face him.
"Elizabeth, wait!"
He opened his mouth to say something more, but nothing came out. After a second, he cursed, and in the next moment she found herself in a tight embrace, being kissed passionately. When he finally released her, All she could do was stand there unsteadily and stare at him, utterly dumbfounded by the intensity of his kiss. "You silly female! Can't you tell I'm crazy about you? Not want to be around you? What a notion! I've only stayed here a month to be close to you. Only I didn't know how you felt about me, and, well," he flushed, "I didn't want to take advantage of you. You have no idea how being near you affects me." He whistled for Castro, who'd gone off to munch on some grass. Upon Castro's arrival, Paxton flung open his saddle-bag and grabbed a brown paper package. "You asked where I was today. I went into town to get this for you." He urged her to go ahead and open it. Still silent, which was an unusual thing for Elizabeth, she unwrapped the parcel and discovered an absolutely beautiful and intricately decorated dress. It's breathtaking." "I was hoping you would wear it on our wedding day." He dropped to one knee and produced a beautiful diamond ring. "Elizabeth Dalton, will you be my wife?" Excitement unlike any other filled her, and it was then she realized he'd shaved and dressed up for the occasion, which touched her far more than she would have thought. In that moment she knew she wanted him, and wanted to be with him forever. That entire day had been empty, drained of significance, because he was not there to share it with her. She could no longer imagine being alone, and she certainly did not want to face a lifetime without him. She swallowed and allowed him to slip the ring on her dainty finger, and smiled at how wonderful it looked there. "Yes," she whispered, and then reached up and kissed him sweetly. After a minute he pushed her away gently. "Whoa, ma'am. We aren't married yet, and there's only so much a man can take." He smiled sheepishly at her. "Now, I suppose we should get going. We have to take this scum to the sheriff and collect the bounty on his head, and then we can be married in town. It's about a 5-hour ride, so we should arrive in town just after dusk if we leave now and keep a good pace." "But we wouldn't be able to be married until the next day. We'd have to share separate rooms, and that is twice the cost. If we left tomorrow morning, we could spend our wedding night at the hotel." Apparently the idea of a wedding night had not been fully apprehended until just now, because she colored shyly at her words, which made her all the more endearing to Paxton. He grinned. "Money conscious, are you? Even with that stash of gold you hid in your cave? You must have more than $10,000 in there." "You knew about my gold all this time?" she asked incredulously. "Yes, but it was left alone. I assure you—" She interrupted him heatedly. "Well, now I can see the real reason behind your marrying me, Mr. Rain." "Golly, you sure are jumpy, aren't you?" he laughed. "I was just going to tell you I've no need of your money. I've my own, and plenty of it. Being a bounty hunter has its advantages. Being a good bounty hunter has even more." Seeing she was still unconvinced, he continued, "Darling, I wouldn't marry you for your money, really. Honestly, you think I'd let you know I was aware of your stash of gold if I were marrying you for your money? Do I look that stupid to you?" She shook her head. "Well, I suppose if you only cared about money, you would be a different sort. A sort like—" She stopped, not wanting to mention Stanton. "And I certainly wouldn't be looking for a rich wife in a mountain valley," he grinned. She relaxed, believing him. "Okay, we can leave tonight." While Elizabeth prepared to go, Paxton searched an unconscious Kent and removed any hidden weapons, and also checked to make sure his bonds were secure. When Elizabeth returned, leading Velvet, Paxton hoisted Kent off the ground and flung him over the mare. "You and I will ride on Castro," he explained, firmly tying their captive to Velvet. He gently lifted her onto Castro's saddle and mounted behind her. She enjoyed feeling his warmth and his strong arms around her. They rode all the way into town, stopping once to subdue Kent, who'd regained consciousness. When they reached the town, Elizabeth was absolutely astounded at the changes that had been made. There were now rows of elaborately painted shops, a larger saloon, a barber shop, and a renovated hotel along the main street. The main street was no longer a pass-through dirt road, but a cobblestone thoroughfare, lined with expensive gas-fueled street lamps and wrought iron benches. Several houses and warehouses also dotted areas that used to be barren. People filled the street while they went about their personal errands of window browsing, shopping, searching for a good time, or simply strolling with a loved one. Everyone seemed friendly enough, with warm smiles and pleasant greetings, but Elizabeth still felt strangely uneasy. The town itself seemed to exude a posh busyness and a type of hostile undertone Elizabeth couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was because she was now a stranger. Things were very different, and the place held such bad memories for her. There was no denying that the town had amassed a great amount of wealth and prosperity. "Elizabeth, would you like to check into the hotel while I take Kent to the sheriff's office?" "No, I'll come with you," she said decidedly, suddenly afraid of bumping into anyone she knew on her own. It had been a long while since she'd been in anyone's society, save Paxton's, Velvet's, and Kent's, if you could count him. The sheriff's office, situated in the very hub of town, was a medium-sized building of wood. A porch with a railing dominated the front, and 4 elongated stairs led to a pair of heavy-duty doors. Kent wrestled about as Paxton hauled him off the horse and up the stairs. Finding both the bounty hunter's grip and his bonds unrelenting, Kent succumbed to his fate. After knocking to announce their presence, they opened the double doors to reveal a large room equipped with a coat rack, 2 plain wooden desks, and some chairs lining the wall. Behind the desks were 2 holding cells, each with thick steel bars, an uncomfortable-looking cot, a filthy washstand, and a stinking chamber pot. 2 deputies, who were unknown to Elizabeth, greeted them, one with a smile and the other with a surly expression. The sheriff wasn't there. The town was generally peaceful, so he usually avoided the night shift. Without hesitation, the deputy took Kent, who had started struggling again, and placed him in a cell. "I'm Deputy Martin, and this is Deputy Howard," he informed them. Deputy Howard's unfriendly eyes narrowed. Deputy Martin, a tall, thin man with tousled brown hair and large brown eyes, held out his hand to Paxton. "Why don't you have a seat and fill us in?" After shaking hands, Paxton went over to a huge bulletin board that was literally covered with announcements, posters, and newspaper articles. "Thanks, Deputy. I'm Paxton Rain. This is Elizabeth Dalton. And the man in the cell—" He placed his index finger on a single wanted poster with an authoritative thud. "Is Harrison Kent." Deputy Howard, who was avidly chewing on a toothpick, sat up glowering. He was the physical opposite of his counterpart Martin, short, overweight, balding, and nasty-looking.
Better make sure, Marty. You don't want to be duped again like last month. The sheriff wouldn't be too happy with another blunder on your record."
Other than his jaw muscles tightening, Martin gave no indication that Howard's comment affected him.
"Tell us how you caught him, Mr. Raine. I'm sure it's quite a tale."
Paxton gave an accurate and entertaining account, explaining how the bounty really belonged to Elizabeth. The deputy, obviously shocked at the details of Kent's capture at the hands of a young and beautiful woman, was speechless.
"A likely story,"
Howard grumbled as he scrutinized the wanted poster, comparing it to Harrison Kent. Martin went over to the desk drawer, and swatting Howard's hand away, which had hastily blocked access to the drawer, retrieved the designated reward money. He thanked Elizabeth for her services rather automatically, still amazed by her courage. She shook her head, declining the money. "Really, Paxton, you should take it."
"Elizabeth, take your money, my dear. Pretty soon we'll share everything anyway,"
he reminded her, winking. "Right." She colored and quickly took the money.
"Enjoy that, girlie. Hope you don't think of me hanging in agony while you're using it,"
Kent said patronizingly, lying down on his bunk, still sore from the bumps and bruises inflicted on him. "Goodbye, Mr. Kent," Elizabeth replied, untouched. "May the Lord have mercy on your soul." Kent grunted, furious that his downfall had been because of a woman.
"He'll hang tomorrow at noon,"
Deputy Howard announced with a disturbing hint of glee.
"According to his wanted poster, he's already been tried and sentenced to death in a county courthouse. He escaped on the way to his execution."
Martin eyed Kent coldly. "That won't be happening this time, Mr. Kent. You can be sure of that." He readdressed Paxton. "We have no reason to wait to hang him. You two, of course, are welcome to attend." "I've seen enough deaths, sir," Paxton said quietly. "Thanks anyways." Then he leaned in close, so only Elizabeth and the deputy could hear him. "Be careful. He's a tricky devil. He won't think twice about snapping your neck if you give him an opportunity." Deputy Martin nodded. "We'll be very careful, sir. Good luck to you, and especially to you, miss." He smiled. "Thank you. Good night." Elizabeth returned his smile. Feeling hungry, they stopped at a surprisingly good restaurant and enjoyed a late dinner. They strolled around town, savoring the cool night air until they reached their hotel. Paxton had insisted on getting the most expensive room in the hotel for his soon-to-be bride. The room was beautiful, with green and yellow laurel trellis wallpaper and an oak hardwood floor, which was delicately accented by a beautiful Persian rug. 2 full-length windows with rich golden draperies flanked the mahogany stained glass door, which led out onto a grand balcony. Elizabeth hadn't even drawn back the drapes to see the type of view her room afforded, but she was sure it was extensive. Her room was also lavishly furnished with an elegantly carved mahogany sofa with golden upholstery, a mahogany and gilt-decorated pedestal-based drop-leaf table, a matching wash-basin, and a chest of drawers with gold etching. In the center of the room was a massive canopy bed with pale lace curtains. It looked very comfortable, soft and inviting. Elizabeth was delighted to discover there was also an adjoining bathroom with a large tub, a full-length mirror, and a cleverly designed dressing table. She removed all of her clothing, glad at the prospect of relaxing in a hot, steamy bath. Paxton had immediately ordered that a bath be drawn for both of them, and she was extremely grateful for his foresight. She had too much on her mind to go to sleep after her soak, so she lay down on a mahogany racamier and scanned the local newspaper. Paxton stayed away from her, which was probably wise. The next morning she awoke and revelled in the beautiful sunshine which poured into her room. Before she'd gone to sleep, she'd opened the drapes and was slightly disappointed by the view of the salon and a couple of houses in the distance. Elizabeth decided she would always prefer Mother Nature to the sight of man-made buildings. She quickly got out of bed and seized the package which contained the dress Paxton had purchased for her. She called for the maid to iron her dress and help style her hair. Paxton, in a well-tailored suit, holding a single rose, met her in the lobby. He paused, taking in her beauty. You look absolutely breathtaking. She did. Her white dress looked as though it had been intended only for her, with its intricately embroidered bodice and flowing double-tiered skirt. Her glorious red hair was done up in a pouf, accompanied by an extravagant bun at the back. Soft, ringlet wisps of her hair played around her neck and shoulders, and there was a string of pearls woven into the thick mane at the top of her head. The overall effect was dazzling, and Elizabeth turned every head in the hotel lobby that morning. Paxton proudly took her arm and led her out into the street. They went directly to the church and were met by the priest, who married them with a simple yet charming ceremony.
Well, Mrs. Rain, what shall we do now? Paxton asked saucily as they left the church.
They stood there, silhouetted by the entrance to the church, for a moment, and then he took her hand in his and kissed it gently. They walked out into the street and noticed the crowd gathering to witness the hanging of Harrison Kent. Paxton shook his head disapprovingly. You'd hope the people of this town would have better things to do with their time than to watch a man die. On the other hand, my dear husband, Harrison Kent murdered and robbed a lot of people. It's important the authorities illustrate the consequences of breaking the law. It's also imperative people feel a sense of justice and retribution. She spoke from experience. The ache that her father's murder and the crimes Maxwell Stanton committed had as yet gone unpunished was still strong. Paxton stared at her, and she felt she'd erred on the side of decorum by contradicting her husband. Now that she was a wife, new rules were in place. But her mother hadn't lived long enough to teach her how to be a proper wife, and naturally her father, being a rancher and all, didn't know much about it or really care. She faltered. Forgive me, I didn't mean to.
Forgive you? He blurted incredulously, understanding her thoughts. For what?
No, I was just surprised by your statement. I'd never thought of it from that angle. I'd only thought about prevention, not retribution. You know, once a criminal, always a criminal. It's a morbid reality in almost every case, that once a person commits a crime, he or she is likely to do it again. However, if the perpetrator is caught the first time, it's possible they'll turn from their life of crime. It's possible, but he didn't mean to continue. Elizabeth, pleased she was praised for her point of view, added, It also depends on the person's reason for committing the crime and their disposition. The debate was interrupted by a voice Elizabeth had wished never to hear again. Elizabeth Dalton? She turned and looked into the steely eyes of Maxwell Stanton. Paxton, who'd noticed the tremor that went through her, looked Stanton up and down with gravity. Mr. Stanton? She whispered, barely curtsying. Stanton eyed Paxton coldly. and then boldly took Elizabeth away from him and started her up the street. "My dear girl, how have you been? It has been ages since I saw you last, and you have become," he relished her, "quite an attractive woman. Your father would be so proud. We put aside our differences before he left, you might say, and became friends. He told me how much he would miss you, and implored me to take good care of you. Did you know your father hoped you and I would one day wed?" She pulled away from him sharply, affronted by his lies. "No," she said tightly. "No, I certainly was not aware of that at all. Mr. Stanton, I would like to introduce you to Paxton Rain." She gestured towards Paxton, who was observing them with dark curiosity. "My husband."
Husband?"
Stanton hesitated, and then offered his hand.
"Mr. Rain, the bounty hunter, if I'm not mistaken. I've heard of you."
They shook hands, but the gesture was devoid of approval.
"I'm sorry. I didn't know.
Elizabeth, I would have appreciated receiving word.
I am your guardian, after all."
Her eyes flashed indignantly. "You never were my guardian, or my friend."
"Well, I must be off."
He pointedly ignored her last statement.
"As mayor of this town, I must witness the death of Harrison Kent. Congratulations on catching him, Mr. Rain."
"I should say so, but as I heard it, Mr. Mayor, it was this here little lady who actually caught the notorious outlaw. Excuse me, Mayor."
A tall, thin, well-dressed man pushed past the mayor and thrust his hand out toward Elizabeth in an eager gesture.
"So thrilled to meet you, Miss Dalton."
He shook her hand.
"Or should I call you Mrs. Rain? I have it on good authority that you were just married, and to the famous bounty hunter Paxton Rain, no less, whom I can only assume is this handsome gentleman here."
He jovially diverted his hand to Paxton, who was slower to respond than his wife had been.
"The name's Bingham. Lester Bingham."
"How do you do, Mr. Bingham?" Elizabeth was delighted to see the man's interruption obviously annoyed Stanton, but she also noted the slight hesitation in her husband.
"Well, as I was saying before I was interrupted," the mayor paused to fairly glare at Bingham.
Yes, yes. I heard you were just about to leave to watch Kent hang. I'll catch up with you later. I've some questions for you, too, Mr. Mayor. So, Elizabeth."
Bingham grasped her arm and led her away from Stanton. The mayor, unsuccessfully striving to hide his irritation, nodded at Paxton, and not looking at Elizabeth once, said curtly,
"Good day to both of you. Rain, Elizabeth."
With that, he laughed. Elizabeth breathed again, although she was anxious for Bingham to leave as well. She wasn't quite sure what she thought of this man. He seemed friendly enough, and yet she sensed a sanctimonious and duplicitous nature within him. Lester Bingham continued unabated.
"If it's not too much inconvenience, I'd really like to question you about the capture of Harrison Kent. Were you wild with fear? Was your life in serious jeopardy?"
He whipped out a small notepad and pencil and started to scribble something down. Elizabeth stared at him blankly, and finally Paxton, approaching them from behind, observed,
"You work for the local newspaper, I presume?"
The man gaped.
"Didn't I say that? Oh, my deepest apologies. Yes, my brother and I own the Cobblestone News. As a matter of fact, we are the only printers in town."
"Mr. Bingham," Paxton began.
"Please call me Lester. I'm sure we're friends here. I've written about you quite often, Mr. Rain. Your exploits are sensational, and I always enjoyed receiving anything concerning you from my colleagues. You're currently a town favorite, and with good reason."
Rain faltered, and Elizabeth clarified, "Lester,
We are indeed flattered and intrigued with your curiosity, and even though we've just been married, I don't mind giving you a little of our time in the interest of the town's newspaper. Ask what you will." Elizabeth was determined not to rub Lester Bingham the wrong way, although she didn't quite understand why. Inwardly, she felt it was imperative he remain an ally. Perhaps it was because she'd surmised that Stanton and Bingham were at odds with one another, and she sensed a sort of affiliation with Bingham as a result. Bingham grinned, comprehending why he'd instantly liked this woman. "I appreciate it, Mrs. Raine." After the interview with Lester Bingham was concluded, and he'd run off to watch the hanging, Elizabeth expected Paxton to bombard her with questions about Maxwell. But he didn't, and for that she was grateful. When they returned to the hotel, Paxton informed the host that they'd just been married, and there was no longer a need for 2 rooms. "Shall we go up, my dear? Or perhaps you're hungry. Would you like to have something to eat, and then maybe tour the town a little?" Paxton asked. She nodded mutely, uncertain of what would transpire when they did go to their room. After all, her mother had died when she was young, and naturally it never occurred to her father to discuss what happened after marriage. Therefore, all she knew was what her tutor had briefly explained, that something beautiful happened between a man and his wife. He'd added a few compulsory physical details before moving on. She wished now he'd been more explicit, though at the time she'd been glad when he'd changed the subject. It now worried her that her husband might be displeased with her lack of knowledge. Hastily deciding to prolong that event for as long as possible, she suggested going out to shop and having a bite to eat. Bedtime, however, was inevitable, and after a wonderful day of sightseeing, shopping, and dining, they grew tired and returned to the hotel. He sensed her hesitation when he, highly motivated, led her quickly to the room. "Elizabeth, what's wrong? Are you nervous?" "Yes," she replied honestly. "I really have little idea of what's going to happen when we," she giggled nervously, "are alone." He grinned, his anticipation climbing. "Worry not, my beloved Mrs. Raine." He grabbed her hand and mischievously pulled her toward the door even faster than before. "You will soon find out." He stopped, looking down at her seriously. "There is nothing to fear, Elizabeth, but if you would prefer to wait a while, I'll understand." She smiled, reassuring herself as much as him. "No, that's all right. I've braved scarier things than a wedding night." He returned her smile and opened the door to the room she'd slept in the previous night, alone. She walked over to the bed and smoothed her hand down the covers, which were soft and welcoming. He approached her calmly, and taking her hands in his, smoothly pulled her close. She savored his irresistible aroma, a nice aftershave of cologne mixed with his own personal scent. "Relax," he kissed her forehead, and then lowered his lips to hers. "Trust me." He kissed her softly at first, and as she shyly responded, more intensely, which made her tingle all over. "My darling Elizabeth," he whispered, as his lips found their way down to her neck, "I love you." Turning his head, Paxton noticed Elizabeth had quickened her pace, after a long, pensive silence. "Why the sudden hurry?" he asked jokingly, having evidently understood her motive. Then his look became somewhat serious. "Elizabeth, I've never asked this, because I believed you'd tell me everything I needed to know. But I can't help a little curiosity after recent events. The man obviously has it in for me, and has a history with you. What exactly is your background with Maxwell Stanton?" "Now is not the time to go into that," she stated, after a drawn-out pause. "It's too hard to tell a long story on horseback. Wait until we get to the cave, and then I will tell you everything."